Your attention, please. Chapter 1. Summers were more tolerable now, and Hastian was thankful for that. Well, that wasn't entirely accurate. Ever since entering the employ of the palace, his schedule had been the dictionary definition of busy, though the bulk of it was spent in either blessed shade or cool palatial rooms. Not to mention the pay was incredible, to say the least. Then again, being the new captain of the guard likely had something to do with his income steadily rising over the months as his candidacy was considered. That, and the ease with which he adjusted to King Galangar's schedule without complaint. He had quickly found the king far busier than anyone expected. Times that had been slotted as breaks devoured in favor of more meetings and nights spent poring over paperwork. Not that Hastian had been privy to such things. His king was a fan of working in his chambers, squirreled away from the outside, until early in the morning. It wasn't healthy, but who was Hastian to judge? Today, though, there were meetings. So many meetings. Enough meetings that Hastian was sure he was going to drown in them, binders and loose leaf piling high around him as figures spilled into his lungs, stilling his breath until his heart could beat no more. He hated meetings. King Galangar seemed to be bored with them, from what Hastian could tell. Bored and exhausted. Getting the hang of reading his emotions had been a challenge. The man's hands made signs, clean and crisp, the easy dialect of someone who was well versed in the manual language. Learning it within 3 months hadn't left Hastian with a sense of the emotive range inherent in it. Facial expressions were also dubious, as they were often used in supplication to signs, adding meaning or distinguishing tone. Hastian was trying. He was trying very hard. Fortunately, or unfortunately for him, this was a meeting the king enjoyed having. For some ungodly reason, he was partial to his financial advisers. How a man could genuinely find joy in the amount of math necessary to follow along, Hastian couldn't comprehend. He had to be here, though, here and present, attending to his king. Meetings were different from other times, namely, in that King Galangar borrowed his guard's voice. Hastian had been permitted to stand beside his charge, where he could see his king's signs clearly and easily, and repeat aloud what his king said. Too many in the royal court had deigned to learn sign language, unable to recognize even basic words. Truly, it was remarkable. It was also remarkable how quickly Hastian's voice went hoarse after 4 hours straight of speaking. When it cracked in the middle of relating how the king wanted to institute a new tax plan, something that would provide the palace with enough funding to run a scholarship program in the Academy of Magics for those who couldn't afford the steep fees, the king paused his sentence, hands stilling as he gave his guard a concerned glance. "Are you all right?" The words were for him and him alone, dark grey eyes glittering with an emotion akin to concern. "Yes." Clearing his throat, Hastian took a sip of the water provided for him. "I'm perfectly all right. Please, my lord, continue." He didn't. "I'm having you speak too much, aren't I?" Before he could protest, the king continued. "My apologies. I forget how much it can grate on one's throat." "You aren't, my lord, I can assure you." Hastian's smile bordered on placating as the advisers gave the two a glance, only able to understand one half of the conversation. "Sir Hastian, please." It was so incredibly hard to resist watching the king's face as he signed, alert for any additional information. "The next time your voice is sore, let me know. I can hear perfectly well, and I can accommodate myself if need be." "My lord, it isn't an issue. I live to serve you." His words were cut off with a scowl. It wasn't directed at Hastian, yes, but the urge to flinch, to beg for his life, jumped to the forefront of his mind. He had made his king angry, and angry kings were not known for their mercy. The elven king was to be a symbol of reason, a bastion of morality, and here Hastian was, ruining his mood. A traitorous tremble worked its way into his hands as his pointed ears drifted down, betraying a fraction of the ice currently running through his veins. Not for the first time in his life. He regretted being born an elf, regretted living in the capital city. Frowning kings meant a trip to the gallows and a stay in the dungeons. Frowning kings meant getting shipped off to a Kiani, off to be either worked to death or molded into a new, more pleasing form. Frowning kings meant... No, he wasn't breathing. Taking a shallow, steadying breath, Hastion got the shaking under some semblance of control. A harsh ear twitch dislodged those types of thoughts, or at least gave the illusion of dislodging thoughts. Different kings were different people. It was important to remember that. King Galangar was not King Esren. Esren the Butcher now. And it would behoove Hastion to remember that. Now, a frowning king meant... well, he didn't know. A year in his king's service, and he still didn't know what it meant when King Galangar frowned. No one did. That was a terrifying thought indeed. Please, Sir Hastion, don't say that. Don't do it, either. King Galangar's signs were sharp, hands making the shapes with exaggerated clarity. I don't want you to live to serve me. I simply require your assistance from time to time. Right now, I require you to sit down and take a drink. I assure you, no one is going to rush in and stab me in this very moment. That wasn't a particularly calming thought, but Hastion could appreciate the effort. If it is your will, then of course, my lord. Sitting down in an overstuffed chair, Hastion avoided the eyes of the advisers, shocked and surprised, wringing their hands under the table. Anxiety ran high in the room as Galangar signed to a nearby attendant for a chalkboard, smiling and mouthing a "thank you," when the poor thing rushed out, eager to obey, and yet more eager to get out of the blast zone when this king no doubt exploded in rage. There were firsts for everything, and Hastion could only hope for mercy. The king would likely want him to properly apologize afterwards for being such a disappointment. Perhaps it would be in private. The king was a highly personal man, and none had seen what his punishments entailed. Most things done in private. Hastion was not allowed into the king's chambers unless summoned, not allowed to attend to him until the king was ready to leave for the day. Nearly 13 months of service, and Hastion hadn't seen him in any state of undress at all, always perfectly poised and made up. Really, it was a joke at this point. How little King Galangar must have thought of him. How little he trusted his own guard so as to not let him into his chambers. At least it made his job easier, staring out at the hallway for hours at a time, trying to remain as focused as he could. It helped to ignore sounds coming from inside the king's rooms. Kings likely didn't like speculation on their personal habits, especially from uppity guards with an overinflated sense of self-worth. That thought made Hastion's fingers curl against the long table dominating the room, nails skittering against black glass. As an attendant handed the king a chalkboard, again with another "thank you," they returned to their spot on the wall. Hastion could see the way their hands trembled, clasped so tightly in front of them that their knuckles turned white. The palace could be quite a terrifying place, now that no one knew what the unspoken rules were any more. Hastion was just happy he hadn't served under King Esren. Very happy about that. With a pleased look on his face, King Galangar held up the chalkboard, now containing the words, "We can continue like this, and let Sir Hastion rest." A few hesitant chuckles spread throughout the room, his advisers nodding along. It was comical. The king writing on a board to communicate with his own court, while his guards sat as if he belonged here, helping himself to water. That King Galangar insisted on the attendants keeping Hastion's cup topped up was not helping. More than anything, he just wanted a clear instruction. Really, that was King Galangar's biggest flaw. He never told people exactly what he wanted, instead poking around to check if his subjects knew his moods well enough to predict the answers he wanted to hear. It was quite terrifying. For now, though, Hastion didn't seem at risk of public correction. If anything, this would likely be one of the few times he would be allowed to rest without fear or pain. If only to prepare him for what his master had in store. King Galangar was almost certainly going to punish him for this, and Hastion would accept it with a smile and a thank you. It was expected of him, and for all that he had been granted, his king could do whatever he liked to him. He couldn't help but notice his king's handwriting. Neat, true. A lingering sloppiness as his left hand scrawled across the board formed the letters of higher speak without much issue. Much like the king. It was beautifully imperfect, and Hastion could spend the entire day watching him write. Well, not like that. Of course, his king was beautiful and gorgeous, especially when the sun hit his blonde hair and made it glow like arcane fire, or when the king smiled and it was the brightest thing in the room. His clothes were the finest things, made of the most expensive silks and fabrics, done up in the new royal colors. Blue and gold looked quite well on him, the minuscule jewels and beads even better. They caught the light and dazzled Hastion, holding his heart fast and mind rapt. Despite his orders, he wanted to be allowed to assist in the mornings. Now, that was foolish thinking. Foolish and treasonous. Kings were beautiful. It was to be expected, and Hastion should stop this train of thought before he got his hopes up. He wasn't even paying attention, simply staring at his king like some kind of moonstruck fool, watching the son of Galalan write his words out instead of using him like his kind was meant to. This wasn't what his training had prepared him for. Before Hastion knew it, the conversation was wrapping up, with promises of reports being filed and the chalkboard being erased once more in favor of writing farewells. Smiles were exchanged, and, all too soon, the advisers exited the room, leaving his king alone in the meeting hall, the silence following the door's close weighing like a noose around everyone's neck. Right. For his insolence, Hastion would face the consequences. This was his fault, and all he could do was politely stare at the room around them, trying desperately to be spared from looking at his king's expression. That was a level of boldness Hastion didn't want to know the result of. No, he could be excused like this, not even daring to look at his king's form. He knew well enough not to be disrespectful. It was taught to any child living in the capital. The king didn't tolerate disrespect. It could always be you on the wall. In his panic, he was asinely watching the way sunlight streamed through the stained-glass windows past the heavy blue curtains. The dark glass table, by all appearances grown out of the very ground beneath their feet, was far too long for Hastion to be sitting like this at his king's elbow. He should be standing and at his post, and apologizing and begging for his king's mercy, and he didn't have permission to do that. His king had ordered him to sit and be silent, and so Hastion was to sit and be silent. A gentle hand tipped his chin up. His heart leapt into his throat, breathing speeding inexorably up. This was it. This was how his punishment started, with an impossible rule to obey. When his face was level with the royal visage, that hand finally slowed, removing itself from his personal space. Swallowing, Hastion avoided those eyes, storm clouds on a summer afternoon, glinting with unreadable emotions. "Sir Hastion, is everything all right?" his king asked him. His king asked him. "Of course, my lord." The words were out of his mouth before he could think. "Please do as you see fit. I am but your humble servant." A pause stretched, words and letters dying on royal hands. Then, with a sigh, the king turned away. Hastion's chest squeezed his lungs tight as the first prickles of tears stung his eyes. Waving away the attendants, King Galangar sealed his fate. As the people filed out, giving him as sympathetic a glance as they dared, he didn't hear much of anything aside from the heavy, final click of the door closing. He had fucked up. He had fucked up so much more than he had initially thought, and now he was going to suffer the consequences. Before his king was forced to highlight his incompetence, The guard knelt down before his master, blood rushing in his ears as tears dripped down his cheeks. How much more of a failure could he be, crying like a child before his punishment had even started? Pressing his forehead into the cool tile as he bowed, Hastion ignored the way his breath hitched in his chest, his voice creaking like an old branch in the wind. "Please, my lord, do as you wish to me. I thank you for this punishment." Shifting of fabric sounded above him, and it took everything not to flinch. King Galangar wouldn't want him to flinch. A good guard didn't, accepting their king's will silently and without protest. Hastion was a good guard. Hastion wanted to be a good guard. The captain should set a good example. This was his duty. It didn't mean he wasn't terrified. He had never messed up like this, bad enough for King Galangar to send everyone away. There would be no witnesses. The king was a private man, after all. Warm and firm, a hand settled on his shoulder. Much to his shame, Hastion's body jerked, tensing up in anticipation of a slap. It never came. More taps to his shoulder enticed him into looking up, trying to ignore the way tears spilled down his face. He wasn't allowed to wipe them away. Why couldn't he control himself? It was a simple thing. Just stop crying. Children behaved better. And here he was, being granted a position in the palace and acting like a spoiled brat. Through blurry eyes he could see his king's words, expression concerned. It was ridiculous that a guard would warrant his concern and mercy like this. "Hastion, you can't know what I'm saying to you if you aren't looking at me." Yes, that was very true. Another one of Hastion's failures. I... Speak, damn fool. "I am very sorry, my lord. It will never happen again, I swear to you. Please." His king, a man who must have been an avatar of mercy, smiled. "It's all right. Really." The royal sleeve wiped at his eyes, no doubt smudging the kohl he wore, if the black smear on dark blue silk was anything to go by. "Just take a deep breath, all right?" Nodding, he took the deepest breath he could, a shallow approximation of obedience. Despite himself, his mouth kept flapping, as if he would be able to sweet-talk himself out of this. "I wouldn't want you to ruin your sleeve, my lord." "It isn't an issue. The laundresses here are unnervingly good at getting stains out of fabric. I'm sure you aren't the first one to get a bit of makeup on it." Again that smile, as if this weren't the longest conversation the two had had. Right. He knew what this was. His king needed to punish him, for his own good. That was clear enough. But he wanted to make sure Hastion understood that this wasn't personal. A light indignation pooled in his stomach. Of course he understood. There was no need for all this. He could accept his master's will as it came and return to his chambers to lick his wounds, if his king allowed it. "Please, my lord, I understand the necessity of this. You do not need to coddle me. I accept my failure and am willing to atone." His voice was steadying. Good. As his eyes drifted down again, a hand pulled his face back up, his king forced to sign one-handed. "Then you should accept that you haven't failed." The disbelief must have showed on Hastion's face, for his king continued. "You haven't done anything wrong. I haven't let you rest, and I overlooked the fact that your voice will get tired. It's quite all right. There's no need to cry." A royal thumb wiped a fresh tear away. "You've been very good to me, and I apologize for using your voice beyond its limits." This must have been a dream. His king was apologizing to him. Kings didn't apologize. 13 months, just a few weeks under a year, and this was how his first correction went. Oh, wait. He understood now. His king likely wanted something more personal. That was fine, actually. better than fine. Hastion knew what he was doing in that case. At least he lasted longer than most guards. He could take pride in that. "Why don't you take the day off? I'd hate for you to be more stressed." He had been wrong. He had made an assumption, and he had been quite wrong indeed. Hastion enjoyed being able to sit and walk normally very much, and taking the day off strongly implied he would be able to do neither. It was fitting, he supposed, since he'd spent so long sitting. His king saw how his face paled and eyes widened. "Or not. You can stay on shift if you'd like." The hand patted his shoulder gently. "I was just going to head back to my chambers to look through some reports. You're welcome to accompany me, if you'd like." He must have nodded, because the hand withdrew as his king stood. Numbly, Hastion imitated the gesture, making himself as presentable as possible, despite how smudged his coal must have been. Everyone would know his fate, but at least this would stop the worst of the glances. Creams and extra bandages would manifest in his room as if by magic, footsteps quiet outside his door, and attendants whispering in hushed voices as he recovered. At least he would be left blessedly alone. Fighting down the urge to simply accept his fate, Hastion composed himself into what his king would want, what he would expect. King Galangar had never been particularly keen on public punishments, from what people could glean. There wasn't a doubt in Hastion's mind that his king was perfectly capable of it. True. But he seemed to favor more personal ones. It certainly didn't help how no one had come forth with a report of what it would consist of. His shoes clicked on the tile, painfully loud, as he walked his king to the royal chambers. Somehow the journey stretched into years. Thoughts bubbled and swirled around his mind of how disappointed his master was going to be with him, how unfortunate tonight was going to be. At least King Galangar seemed kind enough not to push him beyond his limits. Nodding to other guards as they passed, Hastion tried to ignore the looks he was given, faces ranging from concern to dark satisfaction. It was no secret that he was a polarizing figure, the right hand of the new monarchy and the fresh head of the guards, despite being neither the most senior nor the most capable competitor for that position. He hadn't even known he was competing. A not insignificant portion of the older guards had not heralded his rise with much elation, labeling him as a plant for the royals, and a traitor. The king didn't care about that, from what Hastion could tell. It was his problem. He was the captain now, and these were his people. Really, whatever didn't get his head on the chopping block was fine for Hastion. Passing through the richly decorated halls of the palace felt less like a privilege and more a death sentence, the tapestries and paintings mocking him, dyes and pigments snickering behind their artistry. Polished floors gleamed in the summer sun, expensive tile reflecting Hastion's own face back at him, warped and distorted. He tried to get his breathing under control, taking as deep and slow breaths as he could. It didn't help much. All too soon he was standing outside the gold-inlaid door of his king. As calm as ever, King Galangar entered, beckoning Hastion in. The guards on either side of the door gave him a pitying glance as he stepped over the threshold for the first time. Perfect. Just perfect. This was going to spread further. Hastion was the first to be publicly shamed like this, the first needing to be set straight. The door clicked closed behind them, the king busying himself with a latch to ensure no one entered. How kind of him to afford Hastion some time and privacy to get himself into the proper position. A glance around the room revealed nothing convenient to lean on, especially not for a king shorter than him. Neither the desk nor the table would do, and Hastion hadn't been given permission to go into the bedroom. Did that mean he was to get on his knees on the floor? It must have, right? Kneeling, Hastion bowed his head politely as footsteps approached. "My lord, I will take whatever punishment you see fit. I thank you for your mercy." A soft sigh prefaced the king sitting beside him. Gentle hands tipped his face up again. Please look at me. You can't tell what I'm saying if you don't look." King Galangar mouthed the words nice and slow, hands occupied. "I don't want to punish you." "Right. Stupid Hastion. I am undeserving of your kindness, my lord." He should be groveling. He should kiss his king's boots for such mercy. That perfect royal mouth set into a frown as one hand came away. Sign came easier to him, after all. "They really still teach the guards this?" Yes, my lord." Was the king not aware? Maybe it had been his wife to finalize the training schedules. The frown only deepened. "I see. Well, it's lucky that I have the captain right on hand, isn't it?" All Hastion could do was blink, dumbstruck. I suppose, my lord." "How about this for your punishment? You have to remove, His hands drifted aimlessly through the air, as if trying to pick through all possible words for the one he meant. Hastion's hands were already at his belt, anticipating his king's command. "The groveling. It's been a while since I looked through the curriculum. What are you doing?" He blinked at his king, cheeks heating up, a new tremor in his hands forcing his belt to clink against itself loudly. "You asked me to remove something. I apologize for my insolence." "That wasn't what I meant." The tips of King Galangar's ears were turning pink. "Yes, my lord, I understand that now." He was going to die. "My humblest apologies. Please, I welcome whatever correction you deem fit for my boldness." His king's signs were tired, less precise, as if something were weighing on his wrists. "Sir Hastion, please. I don't want to punish you, and I don't want to hit you. If you could get me the documents pertaining to the curriculum for palace staff and guards, then we can put this matter to bed." Well, that was clearly madness. Hastion's punishment was paperwork, and editing the guard's education. Was the king ill? Should he call someone? Evidently, his silence had stretched too long, surprise far too evident. King Galangar's face adopted a more thoughtful look, shifting his position. Oh, Creator take him, Hastion was still holding his belt in his hands. Dropping it with a loud thunk, he tried to pay attention as his king started to sign at him again. "You're right. That may be a bit hard for you to do on your own. I'll just do it myself. Don't worry." A breathy sound that could have been a laugh spilled from the king's lips. Not that Hastion was looking. That would be insolent. "I'll put that on the to-do list. Really, though, are you all right? If you don't feel well, you're welcome to take the day off. I certainly don't mind." This was a test. Hastion was being tested right now. "My place is at your side, my lord." He shook his head. "Oh, please, you don't have to do that." "My apologies, but do what, my lord?" "You don't have to be all formal." King Galangar tucked his legs up under him. "I won't mind. I promise." It was a joke. It had to be. In all honesty, Hastion wasn't sure he could address his king without a title. That level of disrespect? Would his king even identify with his name? Was there a name sign he preferred? Was Hastion being treasonous in even thinking those questions? I do not mean to disrespect you, my lord." "I would not see it as a sign of disrespect." He wasn't going to cry right now. His king didn't want him to cry, and so Hastion was not going to cry. It was silly. He was being silly. This was simply a test. No matter how honey-sweet his king's words were, how kind his face was, How beautiful he looked at every waking moment. That was the danger with him, his sweetness. King Galangar could talk the stars into falling, the moon into giving up her dog-star. King Galangar could stop wars with a word and turn bitter enemies to brothers at the drop of a hat. There was nothing Hastion could do to fight against it, not when those eyes, determined and capable, looked at him with such gravitas. He was going to drown in them. He was going to burst into flames. The fires and floods at the end of the world held nothing on his king. Smoke curled up from his clothing from the force of his king's gaze. Hastion could smell it. King Galangar wanted an answer, and his guard was going to give him one. "Of course, my It took everything to change his words. "Of course, sir, I shall ensure that you receive it." "Good. Thank you, Sir Hastion." That little hint of praise burned into his mind, body letting him know just how much he craved more. The dangers of the new king. With smooth motions, King Galangar stood, eyes still on his guard. Refraining from fidgeting suddenly became quite difficult as he was scrutinized. What an image he must make! Eyes red from tears and kohl all smudged, cheeks burning to the tips of his ears. Maybe his king could overlook the way his skin reminded people of ash, his eyes and hair as dark as charcoal, so unlike the elven standard, so undesirable. It was a foolish thought, but thoughts were foolish things. Hastion was quickly thankful for the way fabric obfuscated his form as images popped into his mind, his shirt pooling with the weight he had lost over the course of several months. Training had not spared him. It wouldn't do for the king to see the effect he had on his guard, how his touches had lingered on Hastion's skin, how his gaze rooted him to the richly carpeted floor. "I do have work to be doing, though." With that smile, the king could ask anything he wanted of Hastion, anything at all. "You're welcome to rest here, but I have to ask that you do not enter my workroom. Many classified documents pass through my hands, and I fear that you are not able to view them all." Wait, what level of classification was higher than the one afforded to the man spending his entire day with the king? "Yes, my—" He cleared his throat, chewing on his lip. "Yes, sir." A gentle hand cupped his cheek once more, squeezing gently, and Hastion swore he could feel calluses on his king's palm. "Thank you, Sir Hastion. Please make yourself comfortable. I'm sure you were familiarized with the layout of my chambers." The warmth withdrew as King Galangar let his hand fall, passing into the other room like it was nothing at all. Hastion stayed like that as the door quietly shut, staring up as if he could see an after-image of his king, bright as the sun. His knees hurt. Ha! His knees hurt. That should have been the least of his complaints after what he had done. Jaw slack as the first time he saw such splendor. A barely audible whine slipped out of his mouth as he shifted, the situation between his legs resolving itself post-haste. His king was just so kind, so beautiful, the epitome of grace. Could Hastion help how his body reacted? Especially when his king was so close, so daring. That was going to be a problem later. But for now, Hastion had to figure out if he really was allowed to move. It wouldn't be ideal for his king to exit his personal workroom and see his guard disobeying his orders. Now, what in the world had he meant by comfortable?